I'd like to ask you, starting off, I went to your exhibition in 1996 at the Icon Gallery, The Garden of Ah. I'd love to hear more about that, please. Thank you.
Okay. So we had two names for it. The Garden of A, as opposed to A. Yes, although it's not an Aleph, it's an A. And obviously the piece was about, I'd collected a lot of material. Yes, from the late 80s, early 90s onwards, I come from a film background as well as visual arts and a theatre background, but I recorded a great deal of things I thought were interesting and important, yes, and connected to how Muslims were being portrayed. Yeah, that partly comes out of a documentary I wanted to make for Channel 4, which I almost got funding for at the start of the 90s, which was had a working title of Terror and Islam. Yes, this is 1990. And it took that from something that one of the secretary of, I think, the Foreign Affairs Committee in Britain had said, that now the Soviet Union was no longer existed. What the real worry was Islam. Yes, and I thought that was interesting, and that stuck in my head. And I thought, okay. And obviously, I'd read Edward Said, Orientalism, but I'd read a lot of other things too by this stage. There's a really interesting writer who wasn't a believer, but came from a sort of Marxist Jewish tradition, Maxine Rodinson, who Edward Said was aware of. I mean, he criticized Edward Said because he said Orientalism hadn't gone far enough because India and the East was also part of the Orient. And Said's had been too narrow in the way that he'd spoken about it. Yes, which Said agreed with. Yes, yeah. Said understood who Maxime Rodinson was and what the work he'd done in the Middle East, and so that view of how Hollywood or television or British TV had portrayed the East, but in this case especially Muslims, and the Gulf War. The first Gulf War happens, yes, and obviously that's very, very significant because a shift takes place in terms of, we know that Saddam Hussein wasn't religious at all, yes, and later on people now realize that actually, I have no support for him politically, but realize that the states that he'd sort of held together with an iron fist had also stopped all sorts of other things growing.
Exactly. Yes? I'm in complete agreement with you there.
So through the destruction of him, but we'll come back to that in part. And obviously even that is a sense of what happens after the post-war period when countries, say, Egypt, maybe it's one of the first, India, Pakistan, even earlier, when countries get their independence, which were ruled by the British, and what ideas of democracy were and are. So these are the countries that have been colonized, and then they win their independence, but in most cases their colonial masters do not disappear. They're still very much part of the scene. So the ideas of democracy, which are supposedly brought from the West, yes, and imposed in sort of these societies where colonial rule is now ended, actually doesn't bring about the same results as it does in the North. And even those are societies built on violence and exploitation of their own populations. Britain had the first revolution before the French Revolution, as in the Civil War, but the way it is held together in terms of the Irish, the Scottish, the Welsh. Yes. So when you took that system and you gave it as supposedly your parting gift, yes, to the country you colonized, and when those countries can't hold it together because they're still in debt to their colonial masters and new masters, they start to fall apart.
Yes.
I'm coming to and then what starts to happen at the end of the 80s, this is the bigger explanation for the background. I understood what was going on because of my political understanding, but also I suppose the space I'd come from. Not everybody who comes from Pakistan or India or Kashmir has a sense of this in the same way.
Yeah.
I have contemporaries who do, and we can talk about who my generation are, yes, and who they were. But so through that, I realized that there was a task to be done of somehow documenting this, yes, in different ways. And what was happening from the early 90s onwards, the Soviet Union collapses, Afghanistan, yes, all of these things happened, but it was very clearly focused around the Gulf War and the images of Muslims. Wow. Yes.
Yes.
The long answer to your short question. And a great deal of this was based on images I'd collected through television. There wasn't the internet. At that stage, you couldn't go to YouTube. So it's literally tapes I've made of things. Tapes from musicals like Kismet, which has scenes that go, Baghdad, Baghdad, it's a wonderful town. Yes, to to the scene in the desert where Marlene Dietrich, somebody turns to, and the mystique of the desert, and Basil Dearden, who was a South African actor, turns to her and says, "The desert, madame, is the garden of Allah." That's the line where it comes from that film.
Yes.
And the film is called The Garden of Allah. But
Sorry,
juxtaposing that with news footage of the Gulf War and footage of Arabs as barbarous.
I think I have to say that what you're talking about for the listeners is you're talking about your video installation, which was in collaboration with another artist. So when I went to the Icon, it was this large screen, and it was your montage that you collected and you put together. So that was really amazing, fantastic work.
So it was 6 monitors, 3 monitors at the bottom, 2 monitors in the middle, 1 monitor on top. And behind a wooden facade, second-hand TVs. The Icon didn't know how they were going to afford this. I said, I know a good Pakistani second-hand television shop, and we will buy their televisions, and then they will buy them back from us. Secondhand, which is how we created that. It was we worked out how the technology, because obviously you didn't have LED screens, with the projection on the floor.
I need to ask you about how you've moved to South Africa, and you're doing a PhD there, and you're a screenwriter, and you're a theatre producer. We've got quite a lot to get through, so I'd love to hear more.
You mentioned my friend. I think I should reference him. So my friend Felix Duroy, who's from the Dutch Antilles, but lives in Amsterdam. So he's from the island of Curaçao. He's a feature filmmaker and a theatre maker and a writer. So I got him involved on that project as the second person, because to have somebody to bounce things off.
Of course.
And we made another installation together about the independence of partition of India and Pakistan, which comes a few years later. You asked me about moving here. I have a sort of a political relationship with South Africa, because I had friends who were in exile in the 80s, 70s, 80s, who were political activists, who probably would have been killed if they'd remained in South Africa, white friends and black friends. And so I had an interest through that, and through anti-apartheid work, and through these comrades who came back to South Africa after Mandela was released, and had no illusions in what the ANC promised, because the reality showed that wasn't going to be possible in the way that they were proposing. So I got to visit South Africa initially in 2004 for about a week or two, through some sort of cultural exchange thing sponsored by the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce. And I was here about 3 weeks, and I spent time in Johannesburg and in East London and in Cape Town. And Johannesburg especially struck me like having the energy of a New York. If I explain that a little bit, and I've ended up living here, and so you'll get that. It's like, for all the messed up reasons of the history and colonialism and imperialism, the US, New York has ended up with a population that's very mixed, yes, as is Johannesburg. So there's an energy here. And there's also a colonial relationship to Britain. But actually why I moved is that I met somebody, and my partner couldn't move to Britain, and I moved to South Africa. But I also, there'd been a cultural exchange program which I ran with the Arts Council for 2.5 years before I moved here, separate from my first visit, which had been bringing theatre performers from Britain and performance poets to South Africa and vice versa. So I had a sense of South Africa.
Yeah.
So I've been here for the last, since 2011. I teach in the film and TV department of an art school, the Wits School of Arts. I teach screenwriting. I did a master's late in life, 10 years ago. I don't have any A-levels. I don't have a first degree. I didn't go to art school, which is probably the saving of me in many ways. Yes, because it's actually broken me out, or in a way that I'm not in silos creatively. So my creative work has really come about through working with people and taking part in workshops and cooperatives and collaborative work. It wasn't through academic study. Yes.
So you share quite a lot, don't you, with society through this approach?
Well,
it does seem that way.
I mean, the era that I got involved in community arts and adventure playground, this is the late 70s. So when you got involved in them, there were lots of them in Birmingham, in Small Heath,
Yes, I heard your interview
Berkshire.
on the Jammu
Yeah,
Kashmir TV,
yeah,
and I'm going to
yeah.
look forward to listening to
We,
more.
we haven't got to that stage yet in that interview.
Sorry,
So,
carry on.
but it's good. It's interesting. It's coming next, so you'll get the more detail. But across Birmingham and across many cities in Britain in the late 70s, there were community arts projects set up by activists, by artists who were very skilled. Many of them had been to art school, but wanted to pass on their skills in another way, not through formal education. And I benefited from that. So when I got into photography, a few weeks after I'd been part of the photography workshop, I was working somewhere and they said, okay, you can run a workshop for the Easter Play Scheme. I said, I've hardly done any photography. They said, that's fine. You've got 2 weeks and you can spend as much time in the dark room, yes, as you need to feel comfortable. And so 2 weeks later, I ran a photography workshop. I was about 18. And it was similar with the other things I learned around theatre and around filmmaking, you know. And when I was part of a theatre project, it involved dance, music for 6 months in London. It worked in a very similar way. So sharing was always part of it. Yes,
It's
you're right.
often, yeah, that's great. Often who we know, I can relate
Well,
to that.
yeah, but also I think you couldn't do that today. You couldn't do it 10 years ago in Britain. You couldn't do it 20 years ago in the way that I was fortunate enough, because that world disappeared in the 80s.
Yes.
Directly. It all died because of the way that funding happened, the economic crisis in Britain, the first areas that were cut back. People think the arts, you know, were well funded 10 years ago. But if you think about 25, 30 years ago, there was a tension between activist artists much more and the state. So money was unlocked for a period.
Is that
Across
when
the
you
country.
left in the 80s?
No, no, no. I left in 2011. I mean, I'm
Oh,
very much part of the British. I know. I have friends who are my age who are like leading British artists. I worked in theatre, so
yeah.
I ran a theatre company. No, I mean, I came in 2011, but I made things at different periods of my life. So earlier on, it was theatre and film,
Yeah.
photography. A lot of it was involved showing work, and theatre, film, photography. And then I started to make installation art. But part of that was inspired. Also, I think I've been lucky that, in the early 90s, you probably were too young, dare I say it, and maybe weren't in Birmingham. So in the early 90s, as a result of working with a very sharing and talented sculptor, Joginder Lamba, who's still alive, I hope. I don't think he's passed away. He lives in Shropshire. So he set up a festival called the South Asian Visual Arts Festival in 92, 93. I can look it up for you. And they needed a project manager. And I, because of my experience of organizing festivals, got the job. And there were 60 artists featured across 16 galleries across the Midlands.
Yeah.
From the Icon to smaller galleries.
Wow.
And I was the project manager.
Fantastic.
And I saw a lot of work, gallery work, video installation work, film work, sculptural work. And after a short while, it's not out of an arrogance, maybe it's a frustration. I realized, it's more out of a frustration. I realized the things that I wanted to make and what I saw that people were making, and I thought there are things I want to make, and I can make these. It wasn't about I can make better work, but when I saw what people were making, I realized that I could also make work. Yes, I was never going to go back to painting. I'd wanted to be a painter. They wouldn't accept me in art school because I didn't have the O levels. But I realized that there were other ways that I could work in making. So that inspired me to make work. Yes, and rather than just curating other people's visual arts work. And these were people who ranged from Shyla Berman to Syed Udris to all sorts of people, people from Birmingham, but 60 galleries. Wow. It also, 16 galleries, it also gives you a social and class confidence, because by going to art school, that's what you gain, because you're part of a layer. Yes, curators often go to art school, study art history and do all those sorts of things. So to be able to convince them, you need a certain language and a certain, I suppose, whether born into class confidence, but the class confidence you get with going to an institution about the arts. So I didn't have that, but that didn't stop me doing other things. But I got that, I suppose, experience by watching, looking, and I was already interested going to galleries, watching work in London. I've been very lucky. I used to, because of my art, my theatre work and my other film work, from my early 20s, I probably went to London once a month, if not twice a month,
Yeah.
for work. Yes,
Wow.
and then I would go to galleries and exhibitions. So I was getting what was going on in London, and because there was a generation, I was friends with the Black Arts Movement folks,
Yeah.
as it later becomes. They were my generation, some of them from Birmingham.
Yeah.
Yes, so I knew what was going on. So my own development has been across the forms. It's never been like a linear thing. Yeah, it's been
I,
across.
I like what you said about class. That's brought something up because that's something that I've not really focused on, I think, because I think maybe like yourself, I don't probably fit into some narratives or some spaces, but my dad always, and I bring this up because I was in retrospect to some of the things that you were saying in a previous interview, um, how your parents and your childhood was a great asset. It really inspired you, and you've got some great memories. And my father said to me growing up, never try and speak Urdu. We're from Gujarat in Pakistan, and he said always. I think he was concerned that people might look down on me or whatever, but it was really good piece of advice. And I was playing around. I thought, okay, but he said, never try and speak Urdu. You speak Punjabi, and you will struggle to try and what he was trying to say is you will be trying to fit in, whereas you don't need to fit in and just be yourself. So I think I've just tried to be myself, whether I just see how things have happened along the way. So that's really interesting.
That's important. I think that's a very important way of looking at it. Yeah, because I know in my case, I knew nobody who encouraged me directly amongst my family, but that's not surprising. Yes, because for as with all migrants, economic migrants, as today people get called, we were obviously of a generation whose parents were encouraged to go to Britain. Yes, so it's not like people wanted to leave to go and eat fish and chips and live under the sunny skies of Britain. I like fish and chips, I like British skies, but nobody would want to move to the country for those things. It was out of an economic necessity and giving your children, and nobody thought of taking children initially, a better opportunity. Yes, and one of the things is that you discover, obviously education helps, that goes without saying, but obviously it also helps about the environment that you're living in and working in and
Yeah.
who you are. Yes, so I was very lucky that I fell in with a bunch of not just artists from when I was 17, 18, they were all lefty progressives.
Mhm.
Most of them were white, but they were
Yeah.
lefty progressive artists, and they were like people who were, somebody who taught silk screen printing was Mike, was Irish, played the blues guitar beautifully. Yeah, and so he used to have gigs where he played guitar, but
Yeah.
what he used to teach us was silk screen printing. He was a very fine
Yeah.
silk screen printer. So you learned that
Of
things moved
course.
across forms. The other part of the class part, which is interesting, wouldn't have happened if I hadn't grown up in Britain, is that when I started to visit India and Pakistan, which is from the late 80s onwards, initially around film and then visual artists, around projects I did, where I met some of the leading visual artists of the generation who survived partition and post-partition, I realized that if I'd been brought up in Pakistan, there's no way on earth that I would have met them. The class differences, even though my family came from landowning, Kashmiri northerners, there's no way the class and the space I would have grown up in would have allowed me access to the Karachi art scene or
Yeah.
the Lahore art scene or to the Mumbai art scene or to the Delhi art scene, which I later had. Yes,
Yes.
and it was interesting,
I can
so
relate to that. Yes.
yeah, because it's very much, you realize that people have come from a particular social class, and
Yeah.
there's, but I think that some of us, that obviously I know a number of people who that didn't hold them back, but of my generation, there weren't that many sort of Kashmiri Pakistanis.
Yes.
There weren't that many South Asians generally.
Of course.
Yeah? Because
So
because our parents didn't speak English. The ones who came from the Caribbean had an advantage because their parents imagined they were coming to the mother country and they were disappointed. Yes, and English was used in their household. Our parents never imagined they were coming to the mother country, and English wasn't the thing they'd been taught in school. So
yeah.
there was I think there was a time delay in generations.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So what is next for Pervaiz Khan? And I know
it's
you have several hats, so I'll let you answer.
in 5 minutes. Look, my work as I look at it, and different aspects of my work reflect different things. I mentioned, I've had poetry published a few times in my life when I was very young, and then later it's been reprinted alongside, Tagore and Neruda and stuff in a collection for young people in the 90s by Hamish Hamilton. But a great deal of my poetry is about love, not all of it. My installation work has been about the uses of the media and how it's portrayed certain different sorts of media, and how key moments in history or political moments have been portrayed. So I can see it in different ways. My theatre work is about stories of people from different places, yes, often outsiders in Britain, yes, always outsiders. Those themes haven't disappeared in my work, yes. So when you ask me, I mean,
So there'll
I'm
be
working.
lots
So
of
when you say
layers, lots of
lots of
layers I can see.
I have a book that I'm finishing,
Wow.
which is not autobiographical, although it takes some of my childhood. The person has more of a sex, drugs, and rock and roll life than I've had, but I've had a more interesting life than that person has. Yes. My life has been far more diverse and interesting than the character, but in that character, there's a lot about the 60s and 70s, and I'm on like the 4th or 5th edit. And when I finish my late in life PhD soon, I'm going to work on that book. But I'm also working on a theatre piece which is being revived, and working on another theatre piece or performance piece for on screen. Yes. So and there are challenges. I mean, in working in South Africa, I can't work in the same way I work in Britain. I'm not South African. I have South African residency, so I don't have any access to any sort of subsidy, even though the subsidy isn't huge here. So the things but that also frees me in a way, because I've had to be quite inventive in what I'm doing. Yes, and how to make that work, and also because I have collaborators, and I think I've been very fortunate throughout my life, from my late teenage right up to now, that I've had really good collaborators. And one of the things I learned early on, that if you're going to have collaborators, it should be people you enjoy working with, and they enjoy working with you, and also they should bring something to the mix that you can't. Otherwise, it isn't much of a collaboration. Yeah. Yes, it shouldn't just be to support your weaknesses. They should be bringing something, just you're bringing something. So it's like a chemical process that brings about something you can't have either of you imagined. Yes, and creative work is, so yeah. And who knows? I mean, there are other things. I have ideas all the time. That's never been the issue. It's about having time to do them.
That was really interesting, and I look forward to hearing more and seeing your work in the future, up and coming future. Thank you for your time. Sorry.
1 minute, you'll use this otherwise. It's an afterword, whether you're transcribing this and you'll tell me what you're going to do with an afterword. My work has involved questions of really like love and justice and humanity in different ways. All of it touches on that.
Beautiful.
Love, justice, and humanity.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah, I can relate to that. Thank you for your time.